Welcome to Failing Forward. I'm your host, Michael Justice. Today's guest is Nathan Weidner. He's the executive director of Pros Media. He's a film and French teacher, and he just finished his latest film called Reckless Mercy. In the movie, the main character struggles to find forgiveness for someone that killed his wife. Nathan finished writing this story after his real daughter was murdered. This movie and all of his films embody his real-life experiences, and ultimately they illustrate his perseverance and faith. Enjoy. So Nathan, just tell your story.
Wow. It starts back like in the 80s. My sister went into broadcasting and I was my older sister, and I was always like looking up to her. And it really, because I was a Star Trek fan and loved shiny buttons, and she worked a control room, I was like, wow, I want to do what you do because you get to push these shiny buttons. That was the humble beginnings of it. So I went to a vocational school for radio and television, but I learned really quickly that TV is a little more repetitive than what I enjoyed. And so I did it for 2 years. And at the end of each year, we had to do a final project. And I always did a movie as my final project. And I realized early on, I'm like, I think I enjoy making films more than TV. So I entered Ohio State University for film. But while I was there, I actually went through a spiritual awakening of sorts, and I felt like I should go into the ministry instead. So I switched my major from cinema to French and started pursuing being a foreign missionary to France.
Wow.
And so I spent about 10 years doing that. I actually met my future wife in France. She was from America, but she happened to be there as well, doing a short-term mission project like I was doing. And so we married in 97. And a year later, we had our first child. And within a month, she was in the ICU with severe seizures. They had to put her under basically like an induced coma to stop her from seizing. And we eventually learned that she had been born with cerebral palsy. And because of her health condition, we weren't able to go overseas. We weren't allowed to leave. Well, at least the Cleveland Clinic advises us not to take her out of the United States. So it fell back on, okay, well, now that I can't minister, like, what do I do? I've got all these kind of half fulfilled dreams here. And so I started using the French to teach in high school. And then I went back to shooting film independently. And a buddy of mine and I got together and had written this movie called Parchigona. We started shooting it in the year 2000. It took a couple years, and it was all shot on videotape. It was very primal. But we got it done in 2002. And in the aftermath of that, it was like, whenever you release something, it's like, wow, you ride such a high off that. And you're like, I'm going to immediately do the next one.
Right.
And it took a little time. We started shooting something in 2004. I did a film called In Other Words, again on videotape. Because the technology, was still developing there, but that's what we had. And it took till 2009 to get that one done.
Wow.
We had people cancel on us, and it was one thing or another, and the footage just sat there, and I finally decided to edit it into something, and it turned out decent. And so, of course, then in 2009, I'm like, riding that wave, I'm like, yeah, we're going to do the next one right now. And so I started writing A Story for Winter, which you're very familiar with.
Right.
That was March of 2009.
Wow.
And within 3 to 4 months of my having written that screenplay, and that screenplay was in honor of special needs kids, like my daughter, Mia. She died in July of that year. And so it really halted us being able to do anything. And we went through this whole... because she didn't just pass away, she was actually killed by, at this point I was divorced, and my ex-wife was dating a fireman, and he had shaken her to death. And so we went through this whole, the court proceedings and a custody issue, because I took custody of my other children in the aftermath of that. And so it just really halted what we were doing. And so for a long time, I didn't do anything.
Right.
I wanted to shoot A Story for Winter. I really wanted to. and I kept trying to get, the hundreds of thousands of dollars that, to do it right, do it right.
Right.
And it never came.
Right.
And so, so I spent about 10 years just kind of helping other people out on their shorts and their competition pieces and stuff. And I value that decade of the connections that I made with other people and what I learned from just working with them.
Right.
And so I went back to teaching and again, teaching French and media production at this point. And I had a student in a media class who turned in a music video. And I was very impressed with how it looked. And I knew he hadn't used the school's cameras. And I asked him, what did you shoot that on? And he said it was his iPhone. And I was like, something, I've spent all this time trying to get all this money to make a story for Winter, and I said, forget it. I'm just going to use what I have.
Yeah.
And so I got the iPhone 12, and as you know, because you were on set with us, we just had an iPhone mounted onto a tripod, and we shot the movie in the summer of 21. And it was just a joy all the way around to shoot that. And we got it done and showed it in November of 21. And within 2 weeks, it was on Amazon Prime, which shocked me that something that was shot with a phone would be accepted on their platform. But again, so here we are. I've just finished a film and I'm riding that high again. It's like, we're going to do the next one.
Yeah.
And this time it happened because in 22, we shot The Name of the Sun. I got together and at this point, I decided I wanted to bring on students on and just show them what to do and just kind of turn them loose and let them use this as a teaching experience for them. So I took a crew to Montana and we shot that.
And what's The Name of the Sun about?
The Name of the Sun is, I'll take you back to the origins of this. There are two reasons why that film happened. And one is when I turned 40, I decided I was going to try to process what have I learned in my 30s. And so I wrote this list of things out. And one of the things that was that it's hard to focus on God when you're in a big city because you're surrounded by things made by the hands of man. And then the second one was my watching a Marilyn Monroe film, The River of No Return. And during the first 3 minutes of that film, they shot that in Alberta, Canada. And it's just gorgeous, just absolutely gorgeous. And they've got like the 1950s movies did. They had an angelic choir of women in the background. Ah.
Right.
It felt like heaven.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I said, look at nature just declaring the glory of God. I'm like, what? I said, how could you be there and not believe that there's a God?
Right.
And those two things meshed. And I was like, what would happen if you took a guy from the big city and dropped him in the middle of that? Would he come out changed? And that's what the film is. It's about a man on his way to an atheist conference, but his plane goes down over Montana and he's stuck for a week in the middle there with nothing but his grandma's ashes. He's got an urn of her ashes that he's trying to inter somewhere. He doesn't know what to do with them. And he goes on this journey with grandma through the wilderness and finds faith.
In all of your movies, correct me if I'm wrong, they're kind of like a metaphorical piece of your life here and there and your journeys and your lessons. And you are kind of like embedded in each one of these characters.
Well, they always say, write what you know.
Right.
And so definitely you're going to find pieces of me coming out of people, even if it's just like, well, in the name of the sun, it's not quite me, but I'm sure there are lines that come out of his mouth that are like Nathanisms over time. And Chasing Glamour would have been that was the next one that we did. People have told me before because they know about my life and what I've lived through, and I've had people suggest, well, why don't you make a movie about your life? And I said, I'm always making a movie about my life. And I'm afraid that if I put it all out there in one, then I wouldn't have anything left, right? For these other movies. So
that's great, Nathan. It's like it is about your life, but it's just certain aspects of it. Like one movie could be about a lesson that you learned. One could be about this valley and one's about the mountaintop, right?
Yeah.
Because as you grow, like we aren't we as people, we are everything we've experienced. If I ask somebody who they are, they might say their name or what they do as a career, but what they are and who they are is really everything they've experienced up to that point. So we're always growing and changing.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. So where did you get the inspiration for Chasing Glamour? And if you could tell us a little bit about what it is.
Chasing Glamour is a story about a man on the night of his wife's funeral. He's Jewish, and they're going to sit shiva the next day, but he can't bear the idea with staying alive, and so he goes downtown to jump off of a bridge that night. But what happens is there's a prostitute walking down the street at the same time, and she propositions him, and he's like, "Well, I'm not about that," and she's like, "Well, why else would you be here this time of night?" And he's not about to admit to her that he's about to kill himself. And so he just goes back to the hotel with her and spends the night with her. And then when he wakes up in the morning, it's like he's back to his senses and he's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? And he does go back home and faces the music with, of course, he's not telling anybody what he just did.
Right.
But he's dealing with this guilt of having used this woman. And he feels like, essentially she saved his life. And he spends the rest of the film trying to save her from the streets so she doesn't have to live in prostitution anymore. That actually came from 2004. That's an old story that was actually written as a short. And I was just, I don't know, thinking one day, it's like, I'm wondering if these people who are sex workers, I'm wondering if they could ever go back to that, if they've ever really experienced making love as opposed to just, working in the sex industry. What would that do if they could actually truly experience love the way that it was intended? And there's two songs that helped me write it. One was Avril Lavigne's "I'm With You," and one is I think it's "Three Doors Down," "Away from the Sun." And I was writing each of those characters, Hoshi and Glamour is the prostitute, from the perspective of the people in those songs. And that helped me write the short. And then eventually I had a buddy who had written Parchigona with me, helped me expand it into the feature length script that it is now.
Wow. So not to give too much away from it, but at the end, is it kind of like what I got from it was they both ended up saving each other, or at least, enlightened each other in some way, like two unlikely characters, like their paths crossing, but ultimately some kind of divine intervention.
Yeah. And I think that really speaks to my perception of life, especially as a school teacher. I've had, you never know whose life you're impacting. You never know what you're doing for somebody. And I've had students come back, the ones that are very obviously engaging with me in class and stuff like that. And you think like, I'm making a big, impact on them, and you never hear from them again. And like maybe 5-10 years later, some wallflower who sat in the back of the room reaches out to you on social media. It's like, man, and they explain to you what the impact you had on them. And I'm like, I had no idea.
Yeah.
You have no idea what you're doing for other people.
Yeah. Like I said that? Oh yeah, of course I said that, right? Wow, man, that's remarkable. And so now you just made what might end up being your biggest project, which is called Reckless Mercy.
Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's that one came from that started in the 90s. I tell you what, back in the early days, when even before I had thrown film out the door and gone the ministry route, I was writing this. It was really just an homage to a friend that I had that we would ride bikes together and stuff like that. He just really had shown me the ropes and taught me how to take risks in life. And so I was kind of just writing it from the perspective of these characters just to show this camaraderie, but I created it in an unlikely manner. A psychologist who winds up in jail, who befriends a murderer. And then I was addressing the idea of, what can you forgive? Can you forgive murder? I'd never experienced anything like that in my life at that point. So I was just writing it from a fictitious standpoint. And it never really went too far. I maybe got like 20, 30 pages of it written on notebook paper and just shoved away. So as we were approaching this next year, and I wanted to work with another group of students, I went to the young man I wanted to write and have direct the film. And I said, I want to co-write something with you. And he said, well, what do you want to write? I'm like, I don't know. Why don't you go through my junk drawer? And he found that script and pulled it out. And he's like, I really like this one. And I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I forgot that existed. And it's like, wow, I've actually lived this now. Because in the aftermath of Mia's murder, that the man went to prison in 2010, and he actually wrote me a letter from prison in 2015 to ask me to forgive him for what he had done. And at that point, I was actually able to, I wouldn't say it was easy to do, but like I was prepared to do it, because within a month after his trial, there was a song that hit the radio by J.J. Heller called What Love Really Means. And in the third verse, she's talking about a man sitting in a jail cell, regretting what he's done and calling out to God, and then God's response to him. And when I heard that on the radio, I broke down and cried, because I started feeling compassion for him. Mm-hmm. I said, because in my mind, my daughter had severe disabilities, and she was in a place now where she doesn't have those disabilities at all. And she wouldn't come back if we asked her.
Right.
And so the tragedy of her life is now over. And the only tragedy left in this world was that there was a man who regretted what he did, and that he's now separated from everybody that he loves. At the moment I knew that I could feel compassion for him was the moment I knew I could forgive him. So I went through that whole journey by 2015. And then, of course, then the screenplay resurfaces. And I'm like, we were absolutely doing this film. And because of all my life experiences, it was so much easier now to finish.
Wow.
I had a lot to pour into it.
I had no idea that you'd started that before her death. I thought that was all, man, that's amazing how that worked out.
It feels, in many ways, it feels like God twice now has prepared me for something I'm about to experience. And of course that, that's 30 some years ago with that one. But with The Story for Winter, I wrote the initial script in a week, and just months before she died. And I felt even with that one, he was like preparing me to deal with her loss.
Yeah.
So,
man, Nathan, that's amazing, man.
They've asked people, especially like my kids, when they went to the premiere, they picked out very quickly. Like in Reckless Mercy, there's a character in there named Ethan. Ethan's a derivative of Nathan. They're kind of like the same name, but just different versions of it. And they picked up very quickly that he represented me, because at the beginning of the film, he mentions that he's, his ex-wife was dating somebody who murdered his 10-year-old daughter named Danielle. He called him Danielle, which Mia's name was Mia Donnell. So that was kind of my way of inserting myself into the film. And I don't know if you knew this either, that whole first scene when they're going through grief counseling, that actually happened. I went to a grief counseling session with an organization. I won't name them because I'm not trying to throw them under the bus, because I think they do great work. But it was people who had experienced the loss through murder, and they happened to just bring in some college students that night because they wanted to witness the impact on victims. And one of the students did ask us about the possibility of forgiving the person who had murdered our loved one. And the room erupted, and not like, yelling or something like that, but it was very negative, and at that point I was already, I'd already heard that song. I was already on my forgiveness journey. And I knew it's like there was so much pain in that room that group was not going to be very beneficial for me to stay there and be part of it. But I felt really bad for these people, because a lot of them don't even know who killed their loved one. And, there's the murderer is still out there. And,
wow.
There's just so many different levels of experience in that room. So yeah, I've poured a lot of real life stuff into this one.
Yeah.
And while Ethan represents me kind of by definition, there's a character in the film, Shannon, it's her sister that was murdered, says a lot of things that actually are more of my emotional expression. Wow. She really emotes what I felt a lot of. And I was telling you earlier that when I wrote the script, it was very therapeutic to get that on paper. But when I went on set, and of course I'm not the one directing, thank goodness I wasn't the one directing,
right?
Because I was standing back and I'm like listening to these lines now coming out of, especially like Shannon's mouth. It gutted me. It was like reliving it all over again. So there were days I was on set and I was just basically being a physical presence, so they knew that the producer was there. But I was worthless. It's just God really took me through it again. It kind of felt like reopening old wounds, and it's like these didn't heal very well. Let's clean this out, and let's sew this up properly. That's what it felt
Wow.
like.
I heard an expression a long time ago. Forgiveness is setting a prisoner free and realizing you were the prisoner. It really speaks volumes about the film, I think. And I can only imagine, man. And I'm inspired by your journey. And I tell you, you have two attributes that I've noticed over some time, and it's very rare, in my opinion: resilience and humility. I meet a lot of people with resilience, but they're not humble. And I meet a lot of people with humility, but they're not resilient. It's very rare that somebody has both. And what really inspires me is your willingness to be vulnerable on film or on the radio. I heard you last week on the river. You know, you're willing to do that for the greater good, and which is for other people to heal, and to use your daughter's story and use that tragedy and find the greater good in that. And I think that's remarkable. I think it's very profound and inspiring, man.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah. So if you want to say something else, you can. If you want to talk, do you want to tell the viewer anything?
I don't know. I could talk for. I'm a
Yeah.
celebrity, Gibbet.
Yeah.
When we drove to Montana for 29 hours, those students in the car with me knew that I would not shut up. Every radio,
Yeah.
every song that came on, like, do you know why that song was written? Do you know what this lyric means? So be careful opening the mic. To
No,
me.
it's okay. Yeah, that's what it's for.
I don't know. So Reckless Mercy. I feel like I will say this. I've been telling people this. I feel like it's my magnum opus. And by saying that, I don't feel like I'm cutting myself short. You know, I do intend,
Yeah.
God willing, that I'm going to live longer and make more movies. But I feel like what I've poured into this, I will never, hopefully never have anything worse or of equal value to pour into a future film. So in many ways, I feel like I've hit my magnum opus. Stylistically, films will probably look better. We'll write things better, something like that. But I just feel like this is the atomic bomb that God gave me to put into a film, and I feel very honored that we've been able to get this out.
Yeah. It's a great movie too. And if somebody wants to see it, when is it going to be on Amazon Prime?
Well, we just submitted it yesterday, so we're waiting on them to approve it. Sometimes it takes a week, sometimes it takes a month or two. It just kind of depends on how many, I guess, they're trying to process. So
yeah,
hopefully soon.
When we walk in our faith, we know that forgiveness is vital, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like God doesn't expect us to forgive somebody overnight, especially if it's something horrific, especially with something like what you experienced. If somebody's watching and they're having trouble with forgiving someone, what would your advice be to them?
I would say probably, because it wasn't until recently someone actually got me to verbalize maybe how I can define what the forgiveness process was, because I couldn't explain. I just knew that it had happened. Sometimes it's hard to put things in words. I said, when it boiled down to it, I loved God more than I hated him. And because God had asked me to forgive him, that out of love for God, that I was willing to do that. And I think the closer we lean into God and just depend on him, the easier. I'm not saying it's ever easy and that it ever just fully goes away. And I will say this, on set, on the way to set, I saw something on a sign that brought back memories of this man that made me hate him. And I'm like, we're shooting the movie about forgiveness, and
Right.
here I am, like, hating him on the way to set again. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is still in there, isn't it? It's something you'll have to contend with the rest of your life, because we're humans, it's just part of our flesh. I got to set that day. Just like 3 to 5 minutes later, I walk into the kitchen, and they're hanging on the fridge. The lady who owns the house rips off a Bible verse a day, and the verse that happened to be on the fridge was, Peter asked Jesus, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother? And I'm like, whoa. I'm like, okay, God, we're gonna work through this again. We're gonna work through this again. So it's not an easy formula, but I just feel like the more we lean into him, the less, and the more that we live in the Spirit, the less we have to wallow in the flesh and all those nasty feelings that come with it. And that's what I feel like that's the best I can explain it.
Yeah. That's great. So it's not necessarily the ability to forgive, but it's more so the willingness. God accepts us where we're at. He just wants to prepare our heart, and it's not going to happen overnight, obviously, but it's just the willingness there. It's what's in our heart toward the person. And sometimes we have to pray for him to change our heart toward them, right?
Yeah.
Well, hey, Nathan, like I said, man, it's been a pleasure. And stay tuned for his movie coming out. It's coming soon to Amazon Prime, Reckless Mercy, and check out all of his other films. We're going to include the link to Pros Media in the description. As always, thanks for watching.
Thank you.
So this is how we